Earth died screaming, not in silence, not in peace, but with a roar that echoed through deep space. Billions of lives gone in a single hour. Cities turned to ash. Oceans boiled. Satellites blacked out one after another, leaving only static and a single transmission that repeated in grim defiance. We tried being civilized. Not anymore. The Galactic Empire called it a surgical strike. A necessary purge. They dressed it up in words like containment, stability, and future peace. But everyone knew what it was. Genocide. Ambassador Alara Voss had watched it unfold from a glass tower on Argia Prime, the Empire's diplomatic seat. She was mid-sentence, advocating for a human-led peace council, when the news feed froze. The screen lit up with flames, then static, then silence, and then came the message. Around her, the chamber of 100 alien delegates shifted uncomfortably. None spoke. None dared look at her. She stood there, trembling, as her planet, her people, were wiped from existence. And the galaxy let it happen. They always feared humanity. They envied its speed, its creativity, its resilience. But most of all, they feared its potential to lead, not follow. So they buried it under bureaucracy. They demanded compliance, then claimed humanity was too aggressive when it pushed back. And now Earth was gone. Later that night, alone in her quarters, Alara played the message again. We tried being civilized. Not anymore. She didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't from any government official or military leader. Just a human, calm, broken, cold. But it carried the weight of an entire species. Captain Ryland Drake had been retired for 5 years. After 27 operations across 2 star systems, 2 shattered vertebrae, and 3 medals he never asked for, he'd left Earth to settle on Titan. When the news came, he didn't scream, didn't cry. He just sat on the cold metal steps outside his bunker, eyes locked on the icy horizon, while the message repeated across every surface. Comms, datapads, embedded retinal feeds. The stars above seemed quieter that night. His comms buzzed. One after another, old names. Ghosts from wars that never officially happened. Major Kess, Black Ops. Singh, Orbital Engineer. Mikhail, Drone Command. All of them saying the same thing. They did it. They really did it. We lost Earth. Drake, it's time. Time for what? Revenge? Justice? No. Those were luxuries. This would be something far simpler. Survival. Because the Empire wouldn't stop with Earth. Mars colonies were already dark. Luna was under lockdown. Civilian transports were being seized, redirected, or outright destroyed under false charges of piracy. Humanity wasn't dying. It was being erased. Drake stood up, joints cracking, his breath fogging in Titan's cold. He went to the old storage chamber and unlocked a crate buried in the floor. Inside was a rifle wrapped in an Earth flag, a hard drive with classified data, and a single card. Project Revenant, in case of annihilation. He stared at it for a long time. Then he opened it. By the end of the week, 10 resistance cells were active across 4 sectors. Half were military remnants. The other half were scientists, engineers, smugglers, anyone who'd lost something and wasn't ready to die quietly. They weren't fighting for territory. They had no home left to defend. They were fighting for memory. Alara Voss had gone dark, slipping past Imperial surveillance and disappearing into the back alleys of Varan 3, a lawless station infested with mercenaries and discarded species. She walked the shadows, trading old contacts, blackmailing others, making deals with creatures that would have once disgusted her. Because diplomacy was dead. Drake met her there, 3 weeks later. The soldier and the diplomat, once symbols of Earth's hope for peace, now plotting sabotage, raids, and something bigger. Something permanent. We can't win a war, Alara said, voice rough from exhaustion. Drake stared at her. We won't fight a war. She frowned. Then what? He looked up toward the sky. We become the consequence. There would be no declarations, no treaties, no surrender, only whispers and fire. The first strike came at the edges of Empire space. A forgotten mining station, once manned by enslaved Terrans, was found empty. Security feed scrubbed. Bodies of overseers lined up in neat rows, their faces calm. Above them, etched into the wall, "We tried being civilized. Not anymore." The message spread faster than light. And the Empire, for the first time in centuries, felt something new: fear. The first ship came out of the dark with no transponder, no warning, just a burning Imperial transport in its wake. Witnesses swore it wasn't real. A myth, they said. A relic from Earth's cold vaults. But it was real. And it wasn't alone. Humanity's ghost fleets had returned. They were old, pre-Empire warships, black-hulled and bristling with outdated yet brutally effective weaponry. Decommissioned by treaty, hidden by oath-breakers, these ships were never supposed to fly again. But after Earth's fall, the old rules died with it. Captain Ryland Drake stood on the command deck of Vanguard, the first of the Ghost Fleet destroyers to reawaken. His eyes flicked over the systems booting to life: tactical AIs, long-range jammers, stealth coding. Each one considered illegal under Imperial law. "Good. Target acquisition locked," his weapons officer said. Drake didn't hesitate. "Fire." A moment later, the Empire's customs frigate that had patrolled the Deimos Belt for 2 decades was nothing but drifting slag. They left a single survivor to tell the others. Across the galaxy, old names whispered back into the void. Revenant 1 to 9. Ghost Wing. The Heretic Protocol. It wasn't a resistance. Not yet. It was memory with a gun. Ilara Voss was no longer an ambassador. She moved through the underworld of dying colonies and backwater moons as a ghost herself, trading favors, unearthing sealed records, and pulling the strings of former allies, too ashamed to speak publicly, but too frightened to ignore the quiet thunder rising in the dark. She no longer argued. She no longer pleaded. She reminded. "Ilara Voss," a voice said behind her in the smog-choked corridors of Station Cora. She turned, hand already on her pulse blade. The man was lean, tired, but his eyes held that old light, human fire. "I saw Earth burn," he said. "I ran. I can't anymore." Ilara nodded. "No oaths. No speeches. Report to Hangar 12, she said. "You're late." The Empire responded with their usual arrogance. A show of force. A diplomatic statement. "The incident in the Deimos Belt is under investigation," said the Grand Spokesman. "We have no evidence of Terran involvement." They couldn't admit the truth. Couldn't show weakness. But privately, they panicked. Security measures doubled. Surveillance systems were scrambled to trace the untraceable. Empire captains were warned. Engage only with overwhelming force. None of it worked. The Ghost Fleet didn't fight in open space. It struck in voids. In dark patches where stars didn't shine. They dismantled convoys, vanished entire patrol routes, and left behind one message burned into bulkheads. Humanity does not forgive. Within weeks, trade routes stalled. Colonies defected. Minor species that had once bowed to the Empire now whispered new prayers. Some to old gods, others to humans. Drake sat in the tactical chamber, surrounded by a dozen other commanders, some veterans, others mere children who had grown up under the Empire's boot. The holomap showed a supply hub near the edge of Sector Theta 4. "High risk, high reward. We hit that, we cut off fuel to half the outer fleet," one woman said. "And draw a fleet response," another added. "They'll come hard." "Good," Drake said. "Let them." They stared. He leaned forward, voice calm. "We don't need to win. We need to hurt them. We need to remind them what fear feels like." A silence settled over the room. Then nods. Orders were issued. War began. The strike was fast. 3 ghost ships emerged from deep drift, gliding past long-range sensors before activating their jammers. A boarding crew of ex-Special Forces hit the station's inner ring in under 90 seconds. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't negotiate. They left the hub in ruins and spiked its reactor just before departure. As the explosion bloomed behind them, Drake stood at the viewport. "They thought we forgot who we were," he said quietly. Ilara's voice crackled over the comms. "And now," Drake watched as the shockwave rippled across the system. "Now we remind them." A week later, An Empire warlord's personal yacht was found adrift near the Varn Rift. Crew slaughtered. Hull painted with the same words. We tried being civilized. Not anymore. Across the galaxy, embers caught flame. A resistance didn't rise. A reckoning did. The galaxy trembled under the weight of silence. For the first time in centuries, the Empire was not the hunter, it was the prey. The news feeds came in waves. Imperial convoys had vanished. The border defenses on Argia Prime failed without warning. Whole fleets went dark without so much as a whisper. The message was the same each time. Humanity does not forgive. Drake watched it unfold in real time from the bridge of Vanguard. The Empire was panicked. Leaders in secret chambers issued decrees. Military commanders frantically recalibrated their strategies. None of it mattered. The ghosts were everywhere. Alara Voss had not stepped into a council chamber in years. Her words no longer carried the weight of diplomacy. But in the seedy underbelly of a forgotten space station, surrounded by rebels and outlaws, she found herself a reluctant queen. Everything we've done, one of the resistance leaders said, shaking a map, it's working. The Empire is splintering. The colonies are defecting. But we're running out of time. Alara's gaze was cold. The longer we wait, the more we lose. The leader stared at her. The question is, do we fight for a chance at freedom, or do we finish what was started? Her silence was answer enough. The Empire, for all its power, had one weakness: its reliance on control. And control was only as strong as its perception of safety. It assumed that the galaxy feared its fleet, its might, its overwhelming presence. But the reality was different now. Drake had changed the rules. The Ghost Fleet no longer needed to hide in the shadows. It was time for the Empire to feel hunted. The first target, the Imperial flagship Eviscerator. The ship was untouchable, its location classified, its defenses unparalleled. But no ship was invincible to humanity's rage. The ghosts waited. At the same time, Ilara stood before a group of rebellious colonies, their leaders uncertain whether to align with the ghosts or risk the Empire's wrath. They had witnessed humanity's vengeance firsthand. Yet they were still afraid. "We don't want war," one of them said, his voice trembling. "Then what do you want?" Ilara demanded, her eyes burning. "To kneel to the Empire until they wipe you out too?" The room was silent. "Then join us," she said, her voice firm. "We're not asking for peace. We're demanding retribution." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. No one had ever spoken like this before. But in that moment, something shifted. The first step toward rebellion was taken. Drake watched as the final pieces fell into place. His fleet of ghost ships had amassed at the edge of Empire space, preparing to strike where the heart was most vulnerable. The Eviscerator was a symbol of Imperial power. It wasn't just a ship, it was the Empire's pride, its final show of dominance over the galaxy. But it was about to burn. On the eve of battle, Drake stood before the map of the galaxy, his eyes scanning the red-tinged sectors. No one had dared to do this before. No one had ever questioned the Empire's right to reign supreme. Until now. "We're not just fighting to survive," Drake said, his voice low and determined. "We're fighting to make them remember who they underestimated." And as his fleet powered up for the assault, the quiet fear of the Empire became the loudest sound in the galaxy. Hours later, as the Eviscerator hung in orbit, surrounded by the Ghost Fleet, Drake's voice echoed through the comms. Launch. The battle was swift, brutal, and final. The Empire's flagship, once a symbol of invulnerability, shattered in a fiery explosion, sending shockwaves across the system. Drake's fleet didn't stay for the aftermath. They didn't need to. The message was clear. Humanity was no longer on the defensive. It was no longer asking for peace. It was making the galaxy tremble. The Empire's walls were crumbling. After the fall of the Eviscerator, nothing was safe. No fleet, no fortress, no border. Humanity had opened the floodgates, and the flood was unstoppable. Systems that once trembled before Imperial dominance now stood defiant. The Empire had underestimated one thing: humanity's will to rise. Drake watched the reports pour in. Another planet fell. Another fleet was decimated. The Empire's once unshakable grip on power was now slipping through its fingers, and with every loss, they grew more desperate. But the true battle had just begun. "Are you sure about this?" Ilara's voice crackled over the comms, her words heavy with disbelief. Drake turned to face the viewport, where the distant stars flickered like dying embers. The plan was simple: strike the heart of the Empire's communication network, take out their command systems, sever their supply chains, and collapse their coordination. It was a calculated risk, a full-scale assault on the nerve center of the Empire. "I'm sure," he replied, voice cold and resolute. "It's the only way to end this." The Empire was broken, but it wasn't defeated. It wasn't over until the last bastion of Imperial leadership fell. "Then may God have mercy on their souls," Ilara said. "Not for them," Drake responded. "For us." The assault was planned in the dead of night, an attack that would leave the galaxy in shock. A convoy of ghost ships, silent and unseen, approached the Empire's core systems. Their target, the Imperial High Command, hidden within the capital of Elysium Prime. It was said to be a city of endless power, built upon the blood and sweat of billions. And now it would be their grave. With precise coordination, the Ghost Fleet dropped from FTL into the Elysium system, shrouded in stealth fields and cloaking technology. There were no warnings, no alarms. The Empire didn't even have time to react. "We move now." Drake's voice was calm but heavy with determination. The fleet scattered, each ship making its move toward specific targets. The High Command's heavily guarded tower stood as the crown jewel of Imperial control, its spires cutting into the sky like sharpened teeth. For all its grandeur, it was about to fall. The first explosion rocked the city before the defenses could react. The first wave hit their communication centers, severing all outgoing signals from the planet. The second wave tore through supply depots, ensuring nothing could be moved in or out. The third wave, the one that mattered most, Drake's own team, broke through the High Command's gates. "You know the plan," he told his team over comms. No mercy. They entered the tower's core, their boots echoing through the silence. The inner sanctum was a labyrinth of metal and glass, filled with more power than any single place had a right to. But it wasn't enough. As they made their way toward the command center, Ilara's voice broke in over the comms. "I've reached the central interface. You're clear." Drake gave the order. "Execute." The moment the command was given, the system's core collapsed in on itself. The High Command's final defenses disintegrated. Data streams were rerouted. Commanders, generals, and political leaders were locked out of their own systems. And the Empire was blind. Back on the Vanguard, Drake stood at the helm, watching as the shockwave of chaos spread throughout the Empire. Their response was instantaneous. The few remaining fleets still loyal to the Empire scrambled to form a counteroffensive, but it was too late. Communication had failed. Coordination was impossible, and the ghosts were already gone. "We've done it," his operations officer said, voice laced with awe. "The High Command is down. The core systems are in disarray." But Drake wasn't celebrating. He had seen this before, the calm before the storm. The Empire would retaliate. They would rally. They would try to regroup, throwing everything they had at them. "We haven't won yet," Drake said, his gaze fixed on the stars. "Not until they know that every system, every world, every colony that's left standing belongs to humanity." The next hours were filled with chaos, as the Empire desperately tried to maintain control. Their fleets scattered to protect vital systems, but the damage was done. The heart of the Empire had been cut out, and its most powerful command structure was in ruins. The galaxy shifted. Once, the Empire had ruled through fear. Now, it ruled through fear of the ghosts. Humanity had become the nightmare the Empire could no longer ignore. Drake stared at the stars, the weight of the galaxy pressing against his shoulders. This wasn't the end. This wasn't a victory. It was a shift in power, a reminder that humanity had finally reclaimed its place. The ghosts weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for everything. And they were winning. The message was clear: fight or perish. As the dust settled over the ruined capital of Elysium Prime, the Empire's final response came not in the form of words, but in fire. The ghosts had dismantled the heart of imperial power, but the Empire wasn't ready to die. In the deepest corners of its last strongholds, the remnants of imperial leadership were rallying, pulling together their fractured forces into one last strike. Drake stood at the helm of the vanguard, watching the first of the imperial fleets break through the edge of the system. The enemy had regrouped faster than anyone had predicted, and now they came with a vengeance. "You know what to do," Drake said, his voice cold and unshaken. The command was simple: take them down. The fleet assembled in the outer reaches of Elysium Prime, each ship a shadow among the stars. The Empire's forces were large, but they were disorganized, desperate, and furious. Every ship, every cruiser, every warship in their armada was a weapon fueled by rage. But they had something the Empire didn't: experience. Drake's fleet had already torn through their ranks before. They had studied every maneuver, every weakness, and now, with their superior strategy, they would do it again. The battle began in silence. The first salvo of missiles, streaking through space like streaks of light in the dark void. But this time, it wasn't about brute force. This time, it was about precision. The ghosts hit hard, disabling one ship after another, and before the Empire could even process the damage, another wave of attacks shattered their defenses. "Admiral," one of Drake's officers said urgently, "the Imperial flagship is moving into position. They're targeting us." Drake's expression remained calm, though inside a fire burned. The Empire's flagship, the Reaper, was their last trump card, heavily armored, with enough firepower to wipe out entire fleets. The battle was going to come down to this: the Vanguard against the Reaper. He made the call without hesitation. All ships, full of evasive maneuvers. Target their engines. Disable their firepower. The Vanguard and its fleet scattered, dodging incoming fire, weaving between massive chunks of debris. The Reaper's cannons fired, their blasts lighting up the space around them. But the Ghost fleet was already on the move, slipping between the attacks like shadows. "Now," Drake barked. The Ghosts came from all sides, their ships flanking the Reaper in a way the Empire's commanders couldn't predict. They unleashed a barrage of missiles, hitting the flagship's vulnerable underbelly. It was only a matter of seconds before the Reaper began to list, its engines failing as Drake's ships relentlessly pounded the hull. Alara stood at her station, watching the chaos unfold. She had always believed in the fight, in the idea that humanity had more to offer than the Empire ever realized. But as the Reaper began to implode before their eyes, she couldn't help but wonder how far they would push this. How far they would go to reclaim their place in the galaxy. The Reaper was dying, but it wasn't the end of the war. The Empire would bleed, but it would not fall so easily. There was still so much left to fight for, and against. The Reaper was finally broken apart, its massive frame floating dead in space, now nothing more than a tomb for the last remnants of the Empire's pride. But there were no cheers, no celebrations. There was only the cold reality of what had been done. The Empire had one final ace left to play: their last fleet, their last leaders, their last hope. They were far from beaten. And though the Ghosts had struck a deadly blow, they weren't finished yet. Drake's voice echoed over the comms. "This is not over. We've won the battle, but the war is still ahead of us. We'll finish what we started, no matter what it takes." As the shattered remains of the Reaper drifted in space, the galaxy held its breath. The Empire's final stand had been broken, but the battle for the future was only just beginning. The stars, once silent and indifferent, now seemed to pulse with the promise of war. Humanity had awakened a beast. And though the Empire was bleeding, it would not die without a fight. Drake knew that the worst was yet to come. The galaxy trembled as the final pieces of the Empire's shattered forces began to fall into place. Drake's fleet had won battle after battle, but the cost was undeniable. The Empire's command had fractured, and in its place, a new, more dangerous force was rising: the Imperial warlords. Each one, more ruthless than the last, was preparing to take the throne by force, and they had an army ready to back them. The war was far from over. If anything, it was entering its darkest chapter. "We've got incoming," the comm officer said, his voice tight with urgency. "A fleet of warlords is heading our way. They've regrouped faster than we expected." Drake's hands tightened around the armrests of his command chair. He'd expected this, knew it was coming. The Empire's collapse had left a power vacuum, and the warlords were already positioning themselves to fill it. "Set course for the front lines," Drake ordered. "Prepare for full engagement. We finish this now." The Vanguard and its fleet moved quickly, leaving behind the scorched remains of Imperial strongholds. The warlords' fleet was massive, but disorganized. Their only strength was their numbers, and their desperation. But desperation could be deadly. As they dropped out of FTL, the scene before them was chaos. The warlord fleets, 6 strong, had already engaged some of the smaller colonies in the region, and their desperation was clear. They were willing to do whatever it took to reclaim the Empire's power. That meant no mercy, no negotiations. They wanted to wipe humanity off the map, and they would use anything to achieve that goal. Drake glanced over at Alara. She was already preparing their forces for the coming battle. "They think they've got the advantage," he said, his voice grim. "But they don't know us." Alara nodded, her expression hardening. "We've fought harder battles. We'll win this one too." The battle began in a blaze of fire. Missiles streaked through space, ships disintegrating in the blink of an eye. The warlords' fleets fought with rage, but it was clear that they lacked the coordination, the unity that Drake's fleet had. They were disjointed, each warlord vying for control, while Drake's forces moved as one. The Ghosts were fast. Their tactics were brutal and precise. The warlords' ships were clumsy in comparison. One by one they fell. But with every ship they destroyed, the warlords grew more determined. They weren't going to lose again. Not this time. "Ilara, take command of the right flank," Drake ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I'll lead the charge on the left." "Understood," Ilara replied, her tone unwavering. The two fleets separated, moving to flank the warlords from both sides. It was a tactical maneuver Drake had used before, and it would work again. But there was one problem. Their opponents weren't as disorganized as they seemed. As Drake's fleet engaged, a massive warlord cruiser emerged from the shadows, cutting through the line like a knife through butter. The Vanguard took the brunt of the damage, shields flickering as they struggled to absorb the blows. "Shields down to 40%, the operations officer reported. "Focus fire on their main guns," Drake ordered, gritting his teeth. "Disable their weapons. Don't let them get another shot off." The battle raged on, the Ghosts fighting with everything they had. But despite their superior tactics and technology, the warlords had the numbers. Every time they took down one ship, another seemed to take its place. Then, just as it seemed like the warlords might break through, a new presence arrived. A massive fleet, unknown to Drake and his crew, dropped from FTL. The ships were sleek, their hulls covered in unfamiliar symbols. They were human ships, undoubtedly, but not from any faction Drake recognized. The unknown fleet opened fire on the warlords with terrifying precision, cutting through their forces like paper. For the first time in months, the Empire's warlords were forced to retreat. Drake stood in silence, watching the unknown fleet's destruction unfold. The warlords were fleeing, their once proud ships now nothing more than debris in space. But who were these new forces? Who are they? Alara asked, her voice as uncertain as his. Drake narrowed his eyes. "I don't know, but I'm about to find out." The warlords were gone, at least for now. But as Drake gazed at the distant fleet that had saved them, he knew this wasn't the end. The true reckoning had just begun. The warlords may have fallen, but someone else was already coming for the throne of the galaxy, and humanity would be ready.